All right, so in our first two videos, we talked about the whole process of decolonization and the partition of India. We talked about the non-alignment movement in that video, and then now in the second video, we moved into Vietnam and life and some of the changes under communist Chinese regime under Mao Zedong with the Great Leap Forward, collectivization of agriculture and industries, and then also the Cultural Revolution and some of the, positives and negatives taken away from that. So now we focus and switch over to the Middle East and North Africa, also known as, Southwest Asia and North Africa, talking about the ideas of Arab nationalism, relations to the creation of the states of Israel and Palestine, and how this connects to some present-day issues with Islamism. All right. So most of the countries that earned independence either right at or right following World War II. So you can kind of see that a little bit on this map here. Egypt well before then, Libya in 1951, Saudi Arabia in the 30s, Iraq around that time too, and then, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, okay, right after that, or kind of again inside of that same process, and then Israel, Palestine, 1947, 1948. So most countries following had to deal with a lot of European and American influence as a result of a different version of neocolonialism in this part of the world in relation to access to natural resources, predominantly petroleum and oil. Right, as many of these are parts of OPEC, which is again that oil producing cartel, and so that's one issue. Egypt with the Suez Canal, and then a lot over the issue of Israel and Palestine. So the governments in the region are a mixture of, at least through early times, military dictatorships, monarchies, particularly again within Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and also you find Islamist governments that do pop up as well. Again, more later on. With some tension related to the Sunni and Shia issues, particularly between Iran and Iraq. So, in particular, we'll talk about some of those here in this video. So, in 1947 and 1948, you have this movement to create two separate states in the territory known as Palestine. The country is known as Israel and Palestine. So, Israel being based on the idea of Zionism and the return of the Jewish people back to their homeland, which they had been kicked out of by the Romans. About 2,000 years prior to this. And so a lot of this is following, pogroms in the late 1800s, which are just kind of anti-Jewish movements and persecutions throughout Europe, and then also following the Holocaust does not aid with that. But also World War I with, the British government with the Balfour Declaration saying that they promised to make a Jewish state out of their mandate in the territory, which many of the Arabs who, had fought against the Ottoman Empire in World War I, fighting for independence, sided with the French and the British, were not guaranteed, again, that independence, but instead more of the mandates to be sought after as essentially a lesser version of a colony to what the British and the French had done in the 1920s and 30s. All right, and so following World War II, you have that movement of more and more Jews, again, following the Holocaust and the end of the war as a continuation, but again, now in even larger mass numbers. The British do not want to deal with that, and then, it turns to the United Nations to, again, declare two separate states in the territory, which we'll see the partition map here in a sec. And so what this does is when they're both granted independence, that leads to a number of conflicts in the territories or in the countries, for the next 25-ish years on and off. Occasionally leading to Israeli victories, with Israel becoming bigger and bigger, resulting of land grabs, not only of Palestine, but also out of Syria and Lebanon, and also Egypt at one time controlling the entire Sinai Peninsula. And so kind of one of the other results of that is the increasing number of Palestine initially disappearing off the map, with Palestinian refugees in Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Syria, and also to a lesser extent Egypt, and kind of that refugee-ish crisis, and leading to the issues that we see today with the debate about should Palestine become an independent country, should it, what are we going to do about the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Jewish settlements in those locations. So obviously a whole lot of, current stuff that we talk about for issues in present day 2021 that spurred from back in the 1940s. All right, so kind of here is our map of, here was Palestinian land concerned with Jewish settlements. All right, so predominantly, Palestinian, but because of that, half the land was given to Israel when they partitioned it. Now, mind you, much of this area that's given, or this located called Israel down here in the south, is very much desert and not very heavily populated, not very dense. But, Jerusalem is supposed to be under United Nations administration. And so what you kind of see here, again, is that split. And then here's 1949 to 1967. with 1967 being the what's known as the 6 Days War, where Israel did a very big land grab, grabbing territory away from again the Golan Heights over here, grabbing the Suez Canal, and then the final major conflict being the Yom Kippur War, which helped to actually balance out the treaties and the territories within Egypt and actually normalizing relations, what we'll talk about here. So you can kind of see Palestinian land has greatly shrunk at the expense of Israel getting bigger and bigger and more Jewish territory. So obviously leading to more modern day issues, including growth of settlements and outposts in the Palestinian-held West Bank. So you can kind of see that. And even with the Israeli Supreme Court saying that these settlements are illegal, the international courts and peoples, for the most part, condemning them, but still not really physically stopping them. So tying this in now with the idea of Arab nationalism. So the idea that, Arab people should be an independent or should have independent states based again along what they consider to be national or ethnic lines. Different Arabic groups, like, Egyptians are different from Jordanians, different from Lebanese, different Syrians, Kurds, and so on and so forth. And so this ties in very much with that creation of the state of Israel and Palestine being, again, subjugated by the Ottomans and then a little to lesser extent to the British and the French, throughout these time periods. And so Egypt leads the anti-Israel actions between 1948 and 1973 and the anti-imperialist actions over against the British and the French under Gamal Nasser. So essentially he became pretty much like a military dictator within Egypt until the time of his death, and tries to bring the region together in anti-Israel movements, in anti-imperialist movements from the French, the British, and the Americans, and also through non-alignment in the Cold War, although they do get military weapons and aid from the Soviet Union. So, and a lot of that comes to a head at what we call the Suez Crisis over the Suez Canal. So in particular, what this all led to was the idea of nationalizing the Suez Canal away from international control so that Egypt could, in fact, make money on taxes and use the money to build up the Aswan Dam to better irrigate the country and actually benefit all the Egyptians as, a result. And so they saw the British and the French and the Israelis saw this as a threat to international trade, condemned it, and decided instead to take the Suez Canal by force, which they actually did, but the U.S. forced them to withdraw because now you're talking about a major choke point for territorial or, the whole point about, getting ships through there for international trade purposes and for the economy and keeping capitalism afloat, obviously flowed heavily through the Suez Canal. Even you think about that one ship just a few weeks ago here in 2021 that got stuck for several days. So you can kind of imagine how big of a choke point this is. So pressure from the United States makes them withdraw, but weakening democratic actions and stances in the Cold War and in the area. And so as a result of this, the USSR, taking this opportunity, condemns the attacks because of what it does to international trade and sovereignty for Egypt. And also this makes them look good to the rest of the Arab world, so much so that many of the weapons used against Israel in the ensuing wars following 1956, so in the 60s and 70s, you'd see weapons being given by the Soviet Union to the Egyptians, to the Lebanese, the Syrians, people who were not necessarily aligned with the United States, like Saudi Arabia. And so we see that even continuing to today, because who gives the most military support to Syria in the Syrian civil war is Russia. So that's a continuation of those movements, right? So that's the whole point of that. So what changes, however, is that, I said 1967, during the 6 Days War, Israel grabbed the entire Sinai Peninsula as part of its land grab away from, and they don't colonize or anything, they just take it to get a better look at Egypt and the Suez Canal and keep a closer eye on Egypt. And then in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, when all these Arab countries attack Israel once again, the resulting 6-week conflict ends with, Israel and Egypt normalizing relations a few years down the road, under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, during the Camp David Accords, where Egypt officially, as the first, I don't know about Muslim country, but definitely the first Arab Muslim country to recognize Israel's right to exist. In exchange, they turn their allegiance more to the United States and starts getting weapons from them and aid instead of from the Soviet Union. So again, kind of a big transition within that, right? So then kind of changing over to another part of the region. So, here is, Egypt, but looking now particularly at Iran and Iraq. So if you look about the Cold War alignment and actually, where is the alignment actually represented? Okay, so Syria, Iraq, Libya, and a little bit of the Yemenis down there getting aid from the Soviet Union. All right, the U.S. actually gave money initially to Iraq, but the rest of them getting aid and supplies from the United States government. So that pan-Arab nationalism, again, comes out of their reactions or the actions of creation of the State of Israel, and then their further actions as they expand, actions of the Western and U.S. democracies in terms of, again, oil industries and backing those up, anti-democratic movements that the United States and their allies support, and the Suez Crisis. But also we have to remember that there is a divide here between the Sunni and Shia. All right, Muslims. So predominantly, the Shia Muslims are predominantly found globally in Iran and Iraq. And there's also a ethnic difference too, because Iranians are not Arab. They consider themselves to be Persian, which is a very different ethnic group, and they do not consider themselves to be ethnically the same. And in fact, they speak a different language than Arabic. They speak Farsi, though they might pray in Arabic. So those are really major things to consider, because Iran, in the 1930s, or sorry, not 1930s, 1950s, and we'll kind of go over that here in a sec, looked for ways to nationalize their industries and, turn towards a democracy, which the United States and Britain did not like, because that was going to hurt oil reserves and oil prices. So they helped install a coup to put the Shah of Iran back in power, or was it a new Shah? I don't remember the exact details of it. But that was in the 50s, and essentially the Shah, pretty much the king of Iran, is backed by the United States and democracies, or again, capitalist countries, Western democracies, and so pretty much begins to suppress political, feelings, the ability to vote, speak out against the government, and so again, as we've seen, as we said about other, actions that the United States engages in, supporting groups of people and leaders who are anti-Soviet and anti-communist, but not always pro-democracy, leading to this kind of thing, down with the Shah, the bloodsucker, and the protests in Iran in the late 70s about, again, political speech, political freedoms, is kind of what the movement starts out to be. But then you also get this Islamist sentiment out there amongst the Shia followers asking for the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was a spiritual leader for the Shia people who had been kicked out of Iran because of, again, his opposition to the Shah, but also more strict beliefs along Islamic lines, Islamic Shia lines. And so what we end up seeing, and this will be included in there, is the overthrow of the Shah. And initially you have a kind of temporary provisional government that then gets overtaken by the revolution of, again, the Shia followers of the Ayatollah. And then we see an Islamic Republic replace this, monarchy system that had been in place in Iran. And that makes that Iran, through the United States' support of the Shah, bringing him into the country when he got sick, leads to the dissolution of good terms with the United States and Iran, including the Iran hostage crisis, and then Iran gets more aid and support from the Soviet Union as a result. So that flow of Islamism, that return to Islamic values in society, such as Sharia law, rejection of capitalism, democracy, and other Western influences like music, films, and clothes, which were all illegal, both in Iran and then also under the Taliban in Afghanistan. They blamed for declining Islamic beliefs and culture, so pretty much saying people were turning against the faith because of the intrusion of Western values spearheaded by the United States and their anti-democratic values, which there is an argument to be made about, supporting anti-democratic governments. But again, going away from traditional Islamic culture was leading to a lack of faith. And so that was kind of their war, their jihad to defend the faith through revolutions, through terrorism that continues to get expired. Iraq then goes to war with Iran, trying to sense weakness, and this is where we actually supported Saddam Hussein for a bit, kind of pushing through that. And so that leads us also to engaging in Iraq in the Persian Gulf War, over, again, issues related to oil. But now what we see is the fact that, we also see a rise of more Islamic movements to return to Islamism to further extents and extremes with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, trying to, again, push off Western values, Western culture, in a return to more traditional Islamic beliefs. So that's where we're going to leave it here for this video. in terms of that push against imperialist powers back then.